Good afternoon. Sorry, that was really loud. Good afternoon. Friends, thank you for coming back following worship. If you are a member or participant here at Hillcrest, friends who have come from other congregations and other parts of the community, welcome. Welcome to Hillcrest Christian Church. Welcome to any folks that we may have joining us via our live stream today. We're happy to be able to share this presentation with you at home as well. I am delighted. Well, I am Laura Blackwood Pickrell. Delighted is not my name. I am Laura Blackwood Pickrell. I'm the senior pastor here at Hillcrest and am so happy to extend our welcome to you today. I want to introduce our speaker and then I'll turn it over to her immediately so that we can get to this. Our speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Lisa Davison. She is the Johnny E. Cadjo Professor of Hebrew Bible at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She is also now the interim dean of that institution, and she's also the head of disciples formation for all of the disciples students who are there at Phillips. And so we are just delighted to welcome Lisa. She preached for us this morning during worship, and now to be able to welcome her back into this space again to share this presentation today. So let's welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Ooh, that is kind of weird. I am so glad to see everyone here, and giving of your time on a Sunday afternoon is a big thing, though at least it's cool inside. It may not be as cool outside. This is a presentation I have given in many, many places. I was saying probably started in Kentucky. I've given it as far west as Washington State and kind of different places within, be it Texas, Oklahoma, and now I'm in Kansas, or Kansas City, Missouri. I have to remember how that works. So. I'm in Kansas. That's right. I'm in Kansas City. I am technically in Overland Park. I know that too. So, all right, let's get going. Basically, this presentation is to kind of go through what we have been known to call or hear the so-called clobber passages. These are the passages that people often trot out when they're making a case against LGBTQIA+ persons being welcomed in the church, in the society, or wherever people are trying to keep them away. I'm going to move fast because we wanted to do this all in an hour. And so I will promise you that there is a handout at the end that has the highlights of each of these passages that you will be given. And that handout is for you to share as much as you want. I know that it's sometimes helpful to hand this to someone who is struggling around issues of sexuality. I've also had folks who say, this really helped me. When somebody started spouting Bible at me, I kind of at least knew a few things to respond with. So it's yours to use as you see fit, or if you want to, use it to line your bird cage or whatever, that's fine too. So I don't have my remote, so I'm just going to do this, and they're going to do that. All right, so just to start with, a little audience participation. If someone walked up to you and said, "What is the Bible?" What would you say? Pardon me? Library, good. What else? Divinely inspired Word of God. A history, good. Guidebook, very good. Answers, good. Experiences of the faithful. I'm glad this is being recorded because I can use this later for my answers. But I'm going to share a bit about how I understand the Bible, because to me, that's important before we dive into biblical passages. So if we're going to start with a couple of things that I think the Bible is not. I don't think that the Bible was written as an objective history. These are the stories of first the people of Israel and then the followers of Jesus that became the followers of the way that we are today called Christians. And I use the term objective in quotation marks because truly there's not an objective history of anything, right? I grew up in Virginia, and if I had read two different books on the Civil War, one written from a Northern perspective, one written from a Southern perspective, I would think that it was two different wars. Because whenever someone puts together a history, they make choices. They tell what they want to be told and how they want it to be told. Second thing that I don't think we're meant to think of the Bible as is a science textbook. Sometimes we find people who want to use it in that way, though when I ask them if they want their doctor to practice medicine based on what we know from the Bible as science, they usually say no. Because the science piece is something that really I don't think the faithful were worried about. They were talking about God and how God had been involved in their lives and in the world. And so when we turn to it to answer 21st century scientific questions, we're asking too much of the Bible. One of my favorite things is when someone comes up to me and says, "What does the Bible say about blank?" One time somebody said, "What does the Bible say about stem cell research?" I said, absolutely nothing, because they didn't even know what a cell was. So it's not a science textbook, but there are a lot of other ways to understand the Bible. These are some that I use. I think that the Bible is a collection of stories by people who claim the same God, a common heritage, and common hopes and dreams. It is a theology book. That is, it's talking about God, but it's not systematic, because if we look in different places to answer some questions like who is God or who are we get different answers, because it is this collection, as someone said, of books, a library that was compiled over time. These are texts that were written across centuries, even millennia, and they all came from different points of view. I like to think of the Bible as a roadmap. It's our faith ancestors leaving behind for us stories that help us know we are not the first people to struggle with what to do and how to live. And so we have their roadmap. And in my opinion, some of that roadmap is sharing with us their mistakes that we might learn from them. I tell students not every story in the Bible is a go and do likewise story. Some stories, I think, are told to shock us, to help us see where we're doing the very same thing and learn from our faith ancestors' mistakes. It's also like a mirror where we can hold up the text and find our place in the story. Now, one thing I learn is that sometimes we find our place in the story always as the hero or as the people that God loves the most. And I often remind my students, like when we're studying the Exodus, and many of them want to be the Hebrew slaves, and I look around and say, well, you're here in a master's degree program. I know that I'm not a slave in that story. At best, I am an Egyptian citizen who benefited from slave labor, and at worst, I'm Pharaoh. So sometimes we have to be honest with where our place in the story is. It is a compilation of voices, as I said, and we know not all of them were included. We have some evidence of other voices left out, so we can imagine how many other voices never made it into the final edit. And then last thing I like to remind folks is that the Bible is a dangerous book. Now, quick little Hebrew lesson here. In Hebrew, there is this word tameh that typically gets translated as unclean. However, that is a very problematic 21st century reading in that I think tameh has a slightly different meaning. As best we can understand, some of these ancient faith ancestors thought we all walked around in a state called tahor, where if you were a woman, tahara. They only had 2 grammatical genders in Hebrew. And sometimes things happen in your life that transform you into a state of tameh. These are things like illness, menstruation, um, bodily emissions, childbirth. Now, when we think about those things today and we hear that's unclean, we get troubled. But there's one scholar, Judith Antonelli, who wrote in her book, In the Image of God, that she thinks tameh actually means extraordinary or changed or extra holy. So think about it. You encounter life and death in those liminal moments. If you touch a dead body, is that unclean? No, but it has the power to transform you. And in the ancient mind, you couldn't walk around all the time in this state of tameh, and you had to stay out of holy places because too much of the divine might make your head blow off. And then I'm joking, but I like to imagine it that way. And it was catching. So you had to be separated from the community until a time of transition had happened and you were welcomed back into the community because you were back in that normal state. Now, that brief Hebrew lesson goes this way when it talks about the Bible. When the Jewish rabbis gathered after the fall of the Second Temple to the Roman Empire in 70 CE, they talked about what books to include in their Bible. And the test was, does this scroll make the hands unclean? Now, in our mind, we think, well, then it gets left out. They were using the word tameh, and it was exactly the opposite. If it made the hands tameh, it was left in because it had the power to transform you. And I think the Bible is a dangerous book because it can be used to deal life and it can be used to deal death. And we who interpret and teach and read and preach these texts need to make certain we're cautious in how we use these words. So that's your Hebrew lesson for now. There might be some later. Next slide. Another thing that is important to ask, and I won't do the audience participation, just save time, is who wrote the Bible? This has a lot to do with how we look at the Bible. And so there are basically 3 answers. The first answer is God. God wrote the Bible. And there are some who, like my dearly departed mother, believed it fell from heaven in the King James English. Others might say, well, humans wrote it, but God was the one guiding the stylus or whatever was being used at that time. Another answer would be, who wrote the Bible? Humans. It was simply a human endeavor. There was one scholar of the Hebrew Bible, Tommy Thompson, who argued that the whole Hebrew Bible was commissioned by the Persians after they defeated the Babylonians because they wanted to give the people in what was then called Judea a shared story, so they had someone craft this story. Now, if we think that sounds far-fetched, I grew up thinking my ancestors came over on the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria, and I doubt they did. I grew up believing that George Washington couldn't tell a lie. Okay, so you see how that goes. The third answer sounds like riding the fence, but it's really not. And that is, some people will say both humans and God wrote the Bible. This is where I kind of rest. I think of the Bible being put together as kind of a dance. And the divine is part of that dance, or you can call it inspiration if you want. And sometimes in those biblical texts, the divine led the dance. And we get wonderful things like love the stranger because you were once strangers. Other times, humans led the dance. And we get some texts like go and kill all the people in the promised land. So it's a human and divine effort. And we have to remember that no matter how it came to be, humans wrote it. And that means the text went through their minds and through their lenses and biases and limited knowledge and experience. And we get texts that we have to be really careful with because of that human element as well as the divine. This leads to a question of authority, biblical authority. Well, the interesting thing about authority is that authority must be granted or recognized. Now, I know if I choose to speed, I can be stopped even if I don't recognize the authority of a police officer or the speed limit. But particularly when we're talking about sacred texts, if you don't grant those texts authority, then they're not going to have a power over your life. Then we have to ask what kind of authority we give and how much authority. We also want to know how the scriptures play into the fact that we have reason and we have traditions and we have experiences. So if we remember, not everyone in our society holds the Bible as an authority, that could change our public conversations, because if you're making an argument based on biblical authority and the next person doesn't hold the Bible authoritative, then it's not going to go anywhere. So just be aware of those things. Now, speaking of authority and who wrote the Bible, I want to say a word about literalists. Now, some of you may call yourself literalists. You may know literalists. You may have family who are literalists. So let's say a word about that. Basically, literalists claim the Bible as their primary or only authority. They also claim they don't interpret the text, they just read them. Which is kind of funny. How do you know what they mean if you don't interpret them? Biblical mandates are seen as absolutes sometimes. And they often say, the Bible says it, I believe it. Now, I have encountered a few literalists in my life. I'll give you one quick story. I was out doing a silent prayer vigil at a church in town that had basically told my friends who were part of the LGBTQIA plus community that they couldn't come to church, especially if they were practicing homosexuals. So we were doing this private, silent prayer vigil in front of the church. And this woman came up with her floppy Bible. You've seen those. I have one. And she was just yelling at my friend who identified as lesbian and just going at her. And, well, I'm not good at silent prayer vigils. So I stepped up and in front of my friend and said, let's have a conversation. So you tell me you take the whole Bible literally. Yes, I do, every word. Huh. Well, let me ask you a question. When Jesus said, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, doesn't look like you've done that. And I swear, I can't make this up. She said to me, he didn't mean that literally. In fact, as Peter Gomes, the former chaplain of Harvard, said, we are all selectivists. We select which texts we want to take with authority and which ones we don't, or which ones are, what would I say, limited by time and place, and which ones are timeless. And how we do that is important. And in the seminary, we use this word hermeneutic, which is basically a framework for how we interpret texts. How do we determine which ones are timeless and which ones are time bound? We need to be able to make those choices consistently. And to tell you the truth, sometimes I encounter people who want to take the things that don't step on their own toes as literal, and the things that do step on their own toes as not literal. Well, be honest about that if that's what you want to say. We have to recognize we all have different reading locations and experiences. We come to the Bible without being a blank slate. So just to let you know, this is Lisa's hermeneutic. It's not new. You'll recognize it. As a follower who's informed by the life and teachings of Jesus, he was once asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he said, Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, or I like to just abbreviate it, love God with all you are. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And that same text goes on to say, and love the stranger. We kind of leave that out. So when I'm reading biblical texts, I ask myself, does this text help me love God with all I am and love my neighbor as myself? Well, if it doesn't, I don't get to throw it out. I'm not Thomas Jefferson. I'm not making my own Bible. So I have to work really hard to figure out why it's in there. Why did people write this down and keep it? And when I find a text that says, love the stranger, love your neighbor, all that, I ask, does it help me love God with all I am? And does it help me love my neighbor as myself? And if it does, guess what? I have to work even harder at interpreting it to make certain I'm not saying it or making it say what I want it to say. So a consistent hermeneutic is what we work for. All right, all of that is to get us ready for the reason why you came, sex, right? That's why we're here. So let me just say a word or two about sex in the Hebrew Bible. Some people are a little surprised when they find out that in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, sex is not inherently bad. In fact, it's the first commandment God gives to human beings. And sex, when it's between two consenting adults, is a God-made thing. That first command, be fruitful and multiply. How are you going to have fruits? You're going to have sex. It's about companionship. It has the potential to be a sacred act. I always tell folks that when you tell youth, just say no, that might work. But if you told youth that God is in the back seat with them, they might make slightly different choices. And then I introduce them to the Song of Songs, which is all this love, erotic poetry. And you know what? It's so small to find it, they have to read a lot of other biblical texts. So it's there, and it's teaching us that God is a part of this as long as it is done in a way that blesses those involved. But like many gifts, sex can be used to be in a harmful way, in a way to degrade another person. So sex is good, it's God blessed, God commanded, but not when I'm doing it just for my own benefit or to demean someone else. Now, to talk about sex in the Hebrew Bible, I need to talk a little bit about the ancient Near East and procreation. So the first thing is to know that Israel, no matter what we might think, was never a large population. They were one of the smaller populations. So survival of a people was their primary concern. And life was very precarious. War, disease, famine could wipe out the whole population just like that. So they had to always push procreation. That's why for women, even though childbirth and pregnancy were very dangerous, some women died before they gave birth or giving birth. They still had to reproduce because that's what had to happen for the people to survive. Some people say that the infant mortality rate at that time was somewhere around 98% who didn't even make it past 2. Women, the average age was maybe 30. Men was a little older because of childbirth. Think about this first story really about a woman who had never given birth was Sarah. And look how old she got. Probably because she never gave birth. Now, God didn't like that, but we'll talk about that another time. So let me talk about Israel's understanding of reproduction. It was based on the fact that they were an agriculturally based community. So it was set up as seed and field. They believed that the male seed, what we would know today as sperm, had everything necessary to produce a human life. The woman was simply the field in which the seed was planted. So when seed was planted and no child came about, who got blamed? Woman, and that's why women are called barren, like barren land. When the seed was planted and a boy child was born, who got the credit? The man. And in this society, when a girl child was born, who got the blame? The woman. Now think about that. We know that's not how the sex of babies is determined. It's not the woman who holds that card. So they had limited knowledge. With this understanding of seed and field, they believed every time seed was produced, semen or sperm, that it had to be directed towards the potential procreation. And when it wasn't, they were risking the survival of the people. So there's actually a story in Genesis 38 about Tamar, the daughter-in-law of Judah, who married Judah's son and he died. And the next son, Onan, had to take her as his wife. And any child they produced would supplant Onan in the hierarchy of inheritance. So Onan saw that. And so he spilled his seed upon the ground. And God struck him dead. Not because of spilling seed necessarily, but because he wasn't doing his duty. If you look up onanism in the dictionary, you'll see a biblical connection there. But that's another story for another time. All right. Also, I just want to point out that in our world today, we are not on the verge of dying out due to underpopulation. That's not our situation anymore. All right. When we turn to the Hebrew Bible, and this is true also for the New Testament, that in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, there was no word at that time for homosexuality. That didn't even come into the English language until the 19th century. Now, this doesn't mean that homosexuality didn't exist. It simply means that biblical writers either assumed everybody was heterosexual, which I doubt, or they were only concerned with this understanding of seed and field and reproduction. So that's why they talked about that. If you find a Bible that has the word homosexual or homosexuality in it, the translation, they made something up, people, because there was no word back then. We do know of certain same-sex acts that were not about loving, committed people. We know that often in the ancient world, when one army would conquer the other, they would rape the male soldiers of the defeated army, not because of sex or attraction, but because of trying to demean that soldier, because in their mind, that defeated soldier played the part of the woman being on the receiving end, and that was a terrible insult. We also know that there were some religious cults, fertility-based cults that probably incorporated some acts of same-sex and opposite-sex behavior. And particularly in the Greco-Roman culture, we know of times when men kept young boys for their own sexual pleasure, and it was called pederasty, and we would know that as pedophilia. And once again, these are not about two committed people expressing their love in a way that makes both of them more of who God created them to be. This is all rape and violence. And we need to know that difference. All right, now, first clobber passage. Some of you may have seen a sign, I've seen them at protests that say, God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It's catchy, but it's really bad biblical interpretation. It's taking a text out of context. We call that proof texting. What we have to remember is both in Genesis 1:27-28, when God says, be fruitful and multiply, that the distinctions were biological, a male and a female of the first humans. And guess what? If they were going to populate and fill the earth, the only way they knew how to do it was through heterosexual intercourse. So that's what the story is about. It's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. And in the second story, this is a story where God made that first dirt creature that was called Adam. We think it's Adam, but it was really Adam, a pun on the phrase Adamah, which means dust or earth in Hebrew. So this first creature was maybe earthling or groundling. That sounds a little sci-fi. But the point is, it was reminding us that humans are made from the same stuff as the earth. And that first creature, no matter what your translations say, did not have a sexual distinction. It was an it. Until God put it to sleep and split it in half. And lo and behold, there were two people, and there was now woman and man. Now, I could get into more fun there, but that's another story. But I will tell you that in some of the Jewish rabbis' imaginations about this first Adam, they thought maybe this was a creature who had no sexual organs. Maybe it was a creature who had both sexual organs, which we know even happens in humanity today. One of the most fun that I read about was they imagined that first human creature had two sides, back to back. And it didn't know there was anyone else, so it was lonely. So God split it in half, and it could turn around and see that it was not alone anymore, and we have woman and man. So in some ways, companionship in the Bible is about finding that which completes us, however that works out. Now, I know that's from Jerry Maguire. If you ever saw that movie, I'm sorry. I thought of it before he did. Anyway, that was all the Genesis text and the catchy phrase. But let's again think through how those texts were written, what their purpose was. They were really more of, dare I say the four-letter word, a myth. Or if you don't like that word, they were creation parables. They weren't telling us how the world should be. They were telling us how the world was and why it ended up the way it is today. All right, the next text, and this is the text that really got me into this business of talking about it. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, from which we get the phrase Sodom, or the word sodomite. It's part of the Abraham and Sarah saga. So you can't just read Genesis 19 by itself. You have to read Genesis 18 to understand 19. So briefly, Genesis 18 at the beginning is when these three strangers show up, and Abraham shows them hospitality, but Sarah does all the work, and he gets to have dinner with them, and Sarah's left in the tent listening. And then as the story goes, the three guests and Abraham leave, and they're on supposedly a place they could look down and see Sodom and Gomorrah. And God decides, after two of the visitors leave, God becomes one of those angels and decides to tell Abraham what God's about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. Because remember, one of Abraham's nephew's Lot was in Sodom. And God says the outcry against the people in Sodom and Gomorrah is great. I have to go down and make certain it's what I've heard. And so God tells Abraham, I'm going to destroy these cities. And Abraham says, but wait, God, what if they're innocent people? And God says, okay, I won't destroy the innocent with the guilty. And Abraham and God kind of bargain back and forth. And Abraham says, if there are just 10 innocent people, will you sweep them away with the wicked? And God says, no, if there are even 10, I will save this city. That scene closes. We go to Genesis 19. This is where Lot, for some reason, is out in the city gate area of the city of Sodom. I like to think maybe he knew it wasn't safe for strangers, because remember, he was a stranger there at one time. The text says that these two visitors, we know they're angels, but Lot doesn't, come to the city and he begs them, pleads with them to come to his home to spend the night because it's not safe to do a night in the city square. So they come to his house and he gives them hospitality, food and drink and shelter. And this is the NRSV that says, before they laid down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people of the city, all to the last man, surrounded the house and called to Lot, bring out your guests so that we may know them. Now, image in our head is that all these men are at the door wanting to know, or as I'll say later, really have sex with these two men, which we would consider gang rape today. And Lot, being such a good guy, says, here, take my two virgin daughters instead. He doesn't win Father of the Year, but that was the hospitality code. These guests were his obligation. Now, I went back to this text in Genesis 19 and translated it for myself. And I'm just going to point out verse 4. Reading directly from the Hebrew and taking into account all the syntactical and grammatical clues, what it read was, at evening they lay down when the people of the city, the people of Sodom, from the youngest to the eldest, all the people of Sodom to the last one surrounded the house. Different image. It's not just the men, it's everybody. Women, children, grandparents, fathers, brothers, they're all there wanting to know the guests. Now, why is this important? How many righteous, innocent people would it take for God to save the city? 10. So if the women and children were still at home, then God shouldn't have destroyed the city. And the phrasing in the Hebrew is very clear. It says, kol ha'am. It was even in the NRSV, but it got wiped over by men in other places. Kol ha'am in Hebrew always means all the people or all the nation. It never just means all the men. It would have said anashim. And so when we read that in context, the phrase that comes before and around it, though it uses anashim, this contextual clue says that at this point, as in other places in the Bible, we use that male, masculine plural noun to indicate a mixed group. So all the people were there to abuse, to gang rape these two visitors. And because the only righteous people, and we debate God about whether Lot was righteous, were the ones in his house. And that's why the cities were destroyed. So again, what's going on? We have outsiders. This is how the people of Sodom treated strangers. Remember, Lot was a stranger. He might have known how this went. To know does mean, I think, to have sex. But remember, it's everybody. Reminds me of when people used to take their families for a picnic for a hanging or something. This is what's happening. It's not men wanting to have sex with men. It's a gang of people wanting to rape anyone who decides to show up in their town. And when we find Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned in the rest of the biblical text, Hebrew Bible and New Testament, their sins are many. Greed, abusive behavior, I think gang rape would fit that, idolatry, and inhospitality. Not a single place says men wanting to have sex with men. And Jesus probably gives us the clearer example because remember, he uses Sodom and Gomorrah as a test of hospitality. He tells his disciples when he sends them out, if no one welcomes you in a town, shake the dirt from your sandals. It'll be better in the day of judgment for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. And guess what? For the longest time, this story was interpreted and nothing was said about same sex behavior. I think the earliest person to really say that was St. Augustine. And I wouldn't want to call him saint either, but that's another day as well. So, Sodom and Gomorrah is about inhospitality. It's about how we treat the most vulnerable in our cities, our states, our country. Now we move on to two other texts that happen to appear in the book that everybody reads cover to cover, Leviticus, right? And most people don't know, but according to Jewish tradition, there are 613 commandments. 613. They were meant for Israel. It was how they were to live to display to others the kind of God they worshiped who cared about all of life. They were intended to make Israel different than the other nations. And so the other thing we sometimes forget is that it wasn't a buffet of law codes. You couldn't pick and choose which ones you wanted. So, you can't say, okay, I'm going to keep 5, 225, 515, and 610. The rest I'm going to let go. All or nothing, folks. And besides, I think somebody that Christians like to listen to said, we don't have to keep any of that. So why is it people want to keep some of them, but they still want their bacon, they still want their lobster, they still want their cheeseburger? Okay. The text we're going to look at is in a section of Leviticus that's called the Holiness Code. So just to get a feel of some of the things required. If a child sasses their parent, they had to be killed. Now, I don't know about you, but if we still kept this one, I wouldn't be here today. Anyone guilty of adultery was to be killed. Now, I imagine Hollywood would be a lot less populated if this was still kept, and maybe DC and maybe some of our own circles. A daughter of a priest who engages in prostitution should be killed. Doesn't even make sense to us today. And anyone who uses the Lord's name in vain should be killed. And this isn't just avoiding the GD word, which I can't say thanks to my mother. It means attaching the Lord's name to something the Lord wouldn't want to be a part of, like war, like slavery, or any other oppression, or I'm sorry, but like football games and basketball games and racing. I'm sorry, I don't think God cares who wins the game. Now, I may have to have a police escort to get out of here, so let me move on. Here are some things this set of text prohibits: heterosexual intercourse with a menstruating woman, harvesting the corners of your field. You had to leave some for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. I can just see Big Ag today doing that, can't y'all? Crossbreeding livestock. Now, I'm a city girl. I had no idea what this means, but I think a donkey and a horse are crossbred to get a mule. That was a no-no. Eating fruit from a young tree, you had to wait till at least the second or third year. And this is the one that always gets people. You cannot have a tattoo. Want to keep that one? I'm not going to look at anybody in particular, though I have to laugh when some of my students come up and say, I want to get a tattoo. And I don't remember if this was you. I want a Hebrew word on it. And I'm like, oh, crap. But, again, we're not keeping all these, so that one doesn't count. And you can't charge interest on a loan. I wish my mortgage company would do that. That would be great. So here are the two texts, Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, very similar. The NRSV reads, you, being male, shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And the second one in Leviticus 20:13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, I'm going to give you a real word for word wooden translation. With a male, you, being a male person, shall not lie the lying of a woman. Or if a man lies with a male, the lying of a woman. Now, why am I giving you this word for word translation? Well, here's what's at issue. First, if two men have sex, they're wasting seed, right? Because it won't reproduce. Here's the good news. There's nothing banning lesbianisms. So if you're a lesbian, it's all good if we take this text literally. The second thing that is happening, I mentioned this earlier, when two males have intercourse, one of them's playing what they would have thought of as the woman's role, the receiver. And again, for a man to be in the position of a woman back then was a great insult. But that's back then, remember? We're in the 21st century. We know a lot more than they did. Then that word abomination, people tell me, oh, it's an abomination. I had a minister call my friend who was lesbian an abomination of God. That was very loving and Christ-like. Well, people think that abomination is the worst sin ever. It's the Hebrew word toavah, and it usually has something to do with ritual impurity or ritual tameh, things that keep you from being in the Holy of Holies or the temple or whatever. But it's not the worst sin. Actually, if we think about it, across the board, there isn't a ranking of sins. A sin is a sin is a sin in that time period. But here are some things considered an abomination. Eating a sacrifice at the wrong time. Eating pork or shellfish is an abomination. So if you had bacon this morning or sausage or lobster or shrimp, it's an abomination. Seeing a menstruating woman naked is an abomination. You get the sense that it really wasn't the worst sin, it had a different meaning. So that's it in the Hebrew Bible. That's all. Out of all the verses in the Hebrew Bible, this is all we got, and they're not even talking about what people want to say they're talking about. And when we get to the New Testament, it's even fewer. And guess how much Jesus said about homosexuality? Not a darn thing. A lot about greed, a lot about judging people, but nothing about that. So, sex in the New Testament, just a couple of things. As the New Testament was being compiled and that group of followers of the way were moving towards being called Christian, the threat was the Greco-Roman culture and assimilation. So most of some of the things we read about that get thrown into this conversation was how to keep this new community separate from those pagans, as they would have thought of others. And in trying to prove the legitimacy of this new movement, it was really young. And, Judaism had been established, but Christianity had to prove that it was a legitimate religion. The leaders, such as Paul, tried to emphasize the sins of Greek religion. So anything that was seen as Greek was to be eliminated from that community. And, this is where we get some things that Paul writes that sound really strange to us too. So let's move to the first text that gets quoted, Romans 1, 26 and 27. I actually had a woman, it may have been the same woman, he didn't mean it literally, who said, well, what about Romans 2, 26 and 27? Romans 2, 20, time out. I know I don't look like I know my Bible, but it's Romans 1. Look it up. So Paul is talking about here what happens if you follow idols. And it just corrupts your whole life. And so we read that women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, men giving up natural intercourse with women, consumed with passion for one another, committing shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons due penalty for their error. Now, why am I highlighting or italicizing natural? Well, that word paraphysin, unnatural, actually has a meaning more like unconventional. Not against nature, but unconventional. And in fact, Paul uses that same phrase to talk in 1 Corinthians 11:14 about men having long hair and women having short hair. It was unnatural, unconventional. Again, I'd be in trouble, but Paul and I disagree on a lot of things. I'm sure we would have disagreed on that one too. Also, notice that what idolatry leads to is really this kind of orgy, this kind of sex for personal pleasure only. And because Paul thought this sounded more Greek, it really was a big no-no. Also, what we forget is that probably this text is referring to heterosexual women and men giving up natural behavior and doing the opposite, which always makes me think what happens when people in the church want to ask LGBTQIA people to give up their natural behavior and go against that nature. Just something to think about. Then, two more texts in the New Testament. They're sin inventories about how you get into the kingdom of God. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 and 10. 1 Timothy 1, 9 and 10. Talking about here's the people who won't get into heaven. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers. Or in 1 Timothy, those who are godless, disobedient, kill their mother or father, murderers, fornicators, sodomites, slave traders, liars, perjurers, and whatever is contrary to the sound teaching. Now, out of all that, everybody focuses on one thing, that sodomite word. They don't want you to tell them that you're not going to get in heaven if you're greedy or if you don't tell the truth all the time. So once again, when we turn to the Greek, the word translated as sodomite is the word arsenokoitai. Doesn't even sound like sodomite. And it's a compound word that has arsen, which is male, and the second part, okoitai, we think means bed. And so probably that term was about male prostitution, which again, Paul said that was a pagan practice, not our practice. And the word translated as male prostitutes is the Greek word malakoi, which actually means soft and lazy. Now, wouldn't that be great? The lazy will not make it into the kingdom of God. I'm screwed again. All right. So here's what happened. Most of the translations would have at first not used that word. I think the King James said male abusers of themselves or something like that. But lately, for a couple of 3 decades, translations have been using homosexuals or sodomites, which the text does not have. Remember, it wasn't even a word back then. We're reading it into the text. Now, that came out when I graduated seminary was the New Revised Standard Version. I thought it was great. Guess what? You read this text, these two texts in the NRSV, it says sodomites. Now, those were the best scholars of Christianity and Judaism, language experts. How did we end up with such a wrong translation? Well, I have it on good authority that the group that put this together, a group of people, which means it was political folks, it was a group who wanted to use sodomite for their own reasons, even though they knew it wasn't the word. And so they traded with this other group, and they got to use sodomite, and the other group got something else. I don't know what the something else was. I've been told it was worth it, but all the history of the violence and hatred against God's LGBTQIA persons makes me ask if it was really worth it. All right, the last passage, Jude 7. In case you don't know, there's only one chapter of Jude. And it's just this little text that makes mention to Sodom and Gomorrah and sexual immortality that pursued unnatural lust. Now, to read this text in context, next slide, we need to know that sexual immorality probably refers to the gang rape we saw in those stories of Sodom, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that unnatural lust, again, that same kind of word, but also know that the people who were hearing and later reading Jude knew the story of Genesis 19. And so unnatural lust may have meant humans who wanted to have sex with angels. And while that happened in surrounding religions sometimes, in this new, what would become Christian community, we didn't believe that humans and angels should have sex. That was kind of what was happening in one version of the flood story, and we know what happened from that. Okay, people, that's it. That's all there is out of all the biblical texts that get to be trotted out and used as weapons to deal death rather than life. All right. I think I might have a few more minutes because we started a little late. So I want to open the floor to you about questions or comments.
I would ask, if you have a question, let me get the microphone to you so that the people watching online can hear what the question is.
Anyone? Bueller? I go into my movie quotes. Yes, there's someone over there.
Come in.
Hold on a second.
Hold on.
So if somebody says, I don't believe in homosexuality, lesbian, whatever, what would you suggest as Bible, I'll say verses, quote unquote, to justify the LGBTQ?
All right. Well, I would first go back to the two Genesis stories to remind us that all humans are created in the divine image. And at the end of Genesis 1 through Genesis 2, 4a, are declared very good, no exception. I would also, if they wanted to talk about that story of the creation of Adam and how that could have been a creature with male and female sides, that first creature may have been even what we would think of today as transsexual or non-binary or however you want to put it. I would also go to the next slide just for a little fun. Oh, next one, that's not fun. There are some sex-friendly texts. So the Song of Songs I would go to and remind us, yes, it's erotic poetry between a male and a female, but some of the themes in there are very appropriate. The couple in that text have to hide their relationship. And in one chapter, the woman goes looking for her lover and is beaten up in the streets. Awfully parallel to some of the news we hear. I I like to use Ruth. Now, I got in trouble with the Roman Catholic person one time in Kentucky about this because I was saying they had sex. But no, I talked about the relationship between Ruth and Naomi as being intimate in ways we don't have to talk about physical intimacy. And I pointed out that that part of the opening story where Ruth goes, "Wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God." We have used that in heterosexual marriages throughout the centuries. Nobody knows it was spoken between two women. And you know what? I love my mother in law. But if something happened to Michael, I'm not going to Lubbock, Texas, no matter what. So I think that covenant there is more than what we would expect between a mother in law and her foreign Moabite daughter in law. Also, note that at the end of the story, it closes with Ruth, Naomi, the child Obed, and the women. Boaz is long gone because Boaz was a seed donor. And then he got some land out of the deal, and Ruth and Naomi and Obed were left to live on their own. There are some, and I heard a wonderful rabbi talk about Jonathan and David. Now, no, we don't want to talk about David. Are you telling me David was gay? Not necessarily, but I do know that his relationship with Saul's son Jonathan was the healthiest, most long-lasting relationship he ever had. He had lots of wives, but that's what kings did back there. At one point, it says that the Nephishim, the beings of Jonathan and David, were woven together. And when David sang about the death of Saul and Jonathan, when he talked about Jonathan, he says, "Your love surpassed the love of women." Again, I'm not talking about whether they had intercourse. I'm just talking about same-sex intimacy that are in the biblical text if we just look. There's some other stories and passages that I could go into, but those are a couple of places that I would go, along with love your neighbor as yourself. Though I think sometimes people who have trouble loving whatever group of people is because they don't really love themselves. And it's hard to love someone else as you love yourself if you don't think yourself loved. There's a wonderful book by Rabbi Harold Kushner, who did When Bad Things Happen to Good People, but I like his book, How Good Do We Have to Be?, in which he talks about the problem with some of humanity's stories is a fear of scarcity. And that if you think God's love is a limited supply and God loves them, then they think God can't love them too. And that's just foolishness. The abundance of the divine is beyond our imagining. So that's just a few things. Sorry, I could go on. Someone else? I've either bored you to tears or you don't want to disagree, which is fine if you want to ask questions and disagree. But again, as I tell people, you could still, in your own lives, say that you do not affirm, accept, whatever, LGBTQIA persons, but you can't use the Bible to sustain that, is what I'm trying to say. Because you're just proof texting and reading things out of context, and you're not being consistent in your hermeneutic. Yes?
Okay, just to kind of, excuse me, go back to what you emphasized pretty clearly, I think. The words like homosexuality does not appear in the original text. That's a construct that came along much later.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And Jesus had nothing to say about same-sex behavior or transsexuals or any of that.
No. And I saw a wonderful quote from former President Jimmy Carter. It was something like, back in the Greek culture, the time of Jesus, they knew about homosexuality, and Jesus said nothing. I also like to point out, remember those two passages in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, When Jesus was asked about the second greatest commandment, he reached right in there between them and pulled out Leviticus 19. Love your neighbor as yourself. If homosexuality was on God's top 10 list, I think he might have mentioned it. Sorry. No, because back then you just used whatever hole had been dug outside of camp, or when they had more permanent ones, it was a whole, again, I just want us to remember, we don't live in that world. And they couldn't imagine what we know. So we know how we get a new infant, and we know that it's not seed and field. Yes. Oh, I saw two. And I'm going to drink water.
Just a comment about the passages that you pointed out in New Testament that were all written by Paul. Paul was never married, and he never would have tried to procreate. At least I don't think he did. So maybe he was as sinful as some of those fornicators he was talking about.
Yeah, some people think him and St. Augustine were protesting too much. I don't care what Paul was. Jesus wasn't married according to the biblical text, which would have been unheard of for a Jewish man at that time. So yeah, some arguments against same-sex marriage is that there's no possibility of procreation because that's what it's for. And I have to tell you, again, we're overpopulating, not underpopulating. And as a woman who's been married 34 years without any children, I am child-free by choice. Then my marriage of 34 years is invalid, if that's the case. And I think there's a book I wrote, if you're interested, called More Than a Womb, Child-Free Women of the Hebrew Bible as Agents of the Divine, I think. I can't remember if it's divine or holy. But I talk about different women's characters in the Hebrew Bible who are never called mothers, never attributed children, and never called barren, but do amazing things like Miriam or Deborah. So that's another resource if people start saying, and today, women's bodies have been put in a different light. And again, I managed to be child-free, and my companion, who's a lifelong youth minister, we had everybody else's children. Actually, being in youth ministry is good birth control. But, sorry. There was another question. We used to tell people when they'd so rudely ask, when are you going to have children? We would say, we have yours. We don't need any of our own. Was there, no, you didn't have a question? Okay. Y'all have been great. Thank you for your time and attention. You'll get a handout. That next slide has my email. Also, Laura knows how to reach me, and Laura knows how to reach me very well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And again, share the handout as you think it can be helpful. Thank you very much.
Before you leave, 3 things, maybe 4 things. One, that handout that Lisa referenced is on a little table that we have pulled out to kind of almost block your way. That table contains 2 things. It contains desserts, and it also contains the handout. Please take both. We would love for those desserts to go home with you. Just desserts, yeah. There are plenty of the handouts. There's certainly enough for every family unit or individual to take one with you. If you need another copy, let me know because we can provide you with the digital version. Those of you watching at home, if you would like a copy of the handout, we can email it to you. You just need to let myself or Pastor Neil know, and we'll take care of that. This presentation has been recorded as a part of the live stream, and it will continue to exist on our church's YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and watch it, if you want to direct somebody else to it, there's a way for you to be able to do that. Beverly, am I missing anything else? Yeah, the other way that you can get to it is to go to our church website, which is hcckc.org. And then if you click on sermons and worship, it directly pulls you into our YouTube channel. And so you'll be able to find it there as well. Again, just another round of applause for Lisa. You do that presentation so well. We're grateful that you came from other churches and that you came from our church here at Hillcrest. As we continue to go through our open and affirming process and discernment, we will have some other presentations at various points, and we'll be sure to make sure that you know about them so that you can come to those too. Have a great afternoon. We're grateful for you.